As soon as he had left, Ben came with the goat, and the news that Local's wife, who herded 2 goats, was very ill and had to be taken to the hospital. As there was only Ben to drive her there, I agreed that he and Local should take her at once to the mission hospital high up in the Jombeni hills so that they could be back again by dark. Unfortunately, this meant that Pippa's family would get no more meat that day, since it was not safe for Stanley and me to go through the bush without a rifle, for which only Ben and Local had a license. But as we had seen several herds of grunt and waterbuck on our way from Pippa to the camp, I hoped that she would kill one of these if she were hungry. Early next morning we returned to where we had left the family, but found no trace of them, nor did we see any vultures to guide us to kill. We searched in vain for the following 2 days and did not even find a spoor. On September 15th, Ben took the Land Rover to repaint to Meru, and so there was alone again in a camp. Exhausted from a long, hard walk to find the cheetah, I poured myself a cinzana at sundown to celebrate the publication of Pippa's book on that day. But where was my spotted sphinx? There was no reason to be depressed, for the family had often been absent for a few days. All the same, I could not help feeling that something had gone wrong. As soon as Ben returned, we split up into twos in order to cover more ground in our search. Ben, carrying a rifle, went with Stanley, and Local, with his rifle, searched with me. From dawn to dusk, we screened all possible places without finding a trace, except that after 3 days, Ben saw a dark-colored cheetah on the road between the camp and Mile 5. From his description, it sounded like Pippa's mate. He had not been near camp since he had seared Pippa's present cubs, and I wondered if they had been together again. George had promised to help us track, and so at lunchtime the next day we drove to his camp. On the way we noticed several baboons perched high up in a leafless tree, staring at the ground. It seemed odd that they should expose themselves to the meat they eat. I drove the car nearer until we saw a lioness under the tree clutching a dead baboon. She must have killed it before we arrived because the body was still unopened. To save the deceased baboons the gruesome spectacle of watching their friend being eaten, I drove the car right up to the lioness, who quickly straddled her quarry between her legs and dragged it to a nearby river. Instantly the baboons dropped off the tree and, racing away, were joined by more baboons who had been watching from distant trees. Late next afternoon, we found a single cheetah spoor, which looked like Pippa's, on a Kenmar road within half a mile of my camp. It turned toward to the rivulet, where we lost it on an overgrown bank. Early next morning, Ben went with Local to follow up with spoor, while I remained in camp in case Pippa should turn up. A little later, Ben returned, breathless. He had found Pippa only 300 yards away, lying under a tree with a broken leg. Rushing after him, I saw her hobbling on a tree legs, the left front leg dangling limp from her shoulder. Every few yards she collapsed, struggled on her feet, and dragged herself on until she fell again. Thus she reached the tree under which her cub had been buried. There she lay down, utterly exhausted. Quickly I gave her milk, the only food I had for her in a camp, which she drank non-stop. She was terribly thin and looked very ill. I sent Ben off to get a goat and asked him on his way by Leopard Rock to try to radio call a vet. I knew that Hawthorns were at present in South Africa, but there were the 2 vets whom Tony had recommended, and I hoped that one of them would be willing to come, even though today was Sunday. I then tried to entice Pippa in the Wairis compound by showing her the meat basket. Trustingly, she staggered after it. I hated fooling her like this, but what it was essential that she should be got into a confined place as soon as possible. Hoping to comfort her, I caressed her, but whenever I touched her, she growled. Obviously, she was in great pain. She had been missing for 9 days, and judging from her emaciated condition, she could not have eaten for at least a week. If she had been near to camp at the time of the accident, we would have found traces of the cubs, so I feared that the injury had happened a long way from here, and that poor Pippa must have suffered agonizing pain in covering the distance to find help in camp. How glad I was that I was here. My abrupt departure from London now seemed almost to have been due to second sight, and my strange foreboding on the day of the publication of Spotted Sphinx had proved tragically justified. When Ben arrived with the goat, we gave Pippa the thorax. She gulped it down so ravenously that she brought it up again. Utterly spent and worn out, she then fell asleep. Ben had not been able to get through on the radio, so we decided that we should drive to Nairobi at once to get a vet. I could not spare my only car because of possibility of an emergency arising, so I hoped that George would lend us on his 3 Land Rovers. We arranged that, during the time it would take for me to drive to George to get the car, Ben would search with local for the cubs and retrace Pippa's spoor. Unfortunately, they found no sign of the cubs, but Pippa's spoor came from the plains where she had given birth to Whitey, Billy, and Tato, some 3 miles from the camp, and led farther still towards the Murera Gola circuit. At tea time, Ben left for Nairobi, and all being well, I calculated that he would be there by midnight. I spent the afternoon with Pippa, feeding her small pieces of meat, but she was very weak and slept most of the time. In the evening, the warden called and we discussed the situation. Pippa would need help for some time to come. I knew that Tony Hartshorn was in principle against removing a wild animal from its natural habitat unless absolutely essential, because it had been proved that for wild animals the need to adapt themselves to unfamiliar surroundings was so harmful that veterinary help in hospitals couldn't compensate for it. The warden, on the other hand, was dead against having an invalid animal in the park for any length of time. What was I to do? I spent a sleepless night listening to Pippa's slightest movement in the enclosure next to my hut. Suddenly, I heard a snort. Rushing out with my flashlight, I saw a buffalo grazing on the far bank of the rivulet. Blinded by my light beam, he thundered off. Soon after this, Pippa gave the low moan she always uttered when she was worried about the cubs. Hoping to get a glimpse of them, I dashed out again and screened the surroundings with the flashlight, but saw nothing. As soon as it was light, I sent Local off to search for the cubs by tracing their spoor. He found that they had slept near the place where the buffalo had been grazing. Their spoor then led to the Kilakatse and farther to the plains, beyond which he lost them. So evidently, Pippa had called to the cubs when they had been frightened by the buffalo, whom I seen off by the glare of my flashlight. While Local continued searching for them, I sat with Pippa, waiting for the vet, assuming that he might have to sedate her for examination. I gave her only a little to eat, although she was hungry. She resented my sitting close to her, which showed how ill she was. I respected her wish to be left alone and sat outside the enclosure, typing letters, which gave me an excuse to watch her all the time without infringing on her privacy. Remembering Pippa's slight limp 9 days ago, I felt remorse at not having taken meat to her that afternoon, because I had thereby forced her in a handicapped state to kill a buck which might have been too big for her. She had a patch of embraced skin above the elbow, which could have been caused by the kick of a hoofed animal. I had often been worried about her preference for waterbuck, which are one of the more common antelopes here, but unless immature, are far too large a prey for cheetah. It was more than I could bear now to see Pippa, which sat a terrible injury, as well as to think of what might happen to her poor cubs. I was glad when George turned up for lunch to comfort me and to help Loco in searching for the cubs. At 3 p.m. an aircraft landed at Kenmare, bringing a vet, Ben, and the pilot. While I collected the party, George returned to the camp without having found the cubs. Having seen Pippa so irritable that morning, I wondered if the vet would be able to examine her without sedating her. I need not have worried, as well allowed him to handle her without the slightest resistance. 2 years earlier, she had reacted in just this way to a vet whose manipulation she had tolerated, although he was unknown to her. I was convinced that on both occasions she knew that these strangers wanted to help her. The verdict was grave. The leg seemed to be broken below the elbow, and the fracture was so bad that the vet wanted to destroy Pippa there and then. I pleaded for a chance to save her. Reluctantly, he agreed, but insisted on taking her at once to Nairobi for an X-ray and possible treatment. Before anesthetizing her for the trip, he asked me to sign my agreement for him to destroy her should he find it necessary. I had no choice but to sign if I wanted to save Pippa's life, but I almost fainted. The vet then injected the anesthetic, the dose based on a weight of 100-pound body. Pippa reacted instantly. He then tied her legs and pulled a muzzle so tight that Pippa had 2 fits, during which her tongue protruded between her firmly tied lips. Fearing that she might bite through her tongue in a convulsion, I begged to have the rope loosened a little, but he insisted on this measure as he had previously been mauled by a cheetah under similar circumstances. I hoped that I could fly with Pippa to Nairobi by taking Ben's seat, but the vet preferred me to stay behind, and Ben went instead. Before the plane took off at 5 p.m., we arranged that I should drive with George straight to Nairobi so that I could be with Pippa, and that Ben should return early next morning with George's Land Rover and look after the cubs while I was away. Watching a plane disappear into space with an injured animal inside, it has always been a heartbreak. This time I felt as if the last drop of blood would drain from me. But there was no time to lose, and I packed up my kit, ready to start immediately. George, however, was worried about Sandy. It would not leave till next morning. I spent the night at his camp, and we drove off at dawn. On the way, we met Ben, returning. He told us that Pippa had been so ill on her arrival that the vet had worried whether she would survive. He had weighed her and found that in her emaciated state the scales showed only 71 pounds, compared with a healthy cheetah body weight of 100 pounds. No wonder poor Pippa had reacted so violently to an anesthetizing overdose. At the hospital, the vet had vaccinated her against feline enteritis and put the broken leg into a plaster cast. After she had been begged on, Pippa had settled down, and when Ben saw her that morning, she seemed a little better. Much relieved, I asked him to write me daily news of the cubs. By 3 p.m., I was with Pippa in the hospital section of the animal orphanage. She had not come around from the anesthetic, and her leg was in plaster from the shoulder downward. Her pen was about 5 by 8 feet, adjoining similar-sized enclosures with 4 cheetah cubs in one and young duiker in the one. Opposite was a larger pen containing 5 cheetah cubs. All 9 cubs had been recently found abandoned and were now kept here for observation after being vaccinated against feline entities. There were also 5 tiny lion cubs with mangry skins who had been found without a mother. All these animals were housed in the headquarters building of the original orphanage, which had been converted into an animal hospital after a better orphanage had recently been built. Both establishments belonged to the Kenya National Parks and were situated to right and left of the main entrance gate. Visitors were encouraged to see the inhabitants in the new orphanage where the animals were detained until they could be released, but they were not permitted to disturb the sick animals who were kept in outdoor paddocks on the old orphanage site, let alone enter the hospital. We called on the director of the Kenya National Parks, Paris Olindo, who was an old friend of mine. Hearing of Pippa's predicament, he was very sympathetic and offered his help. We also knew the warden of the orphanage, Julian Tong, well enough to ask if I could stay with him and his wife as a paying guest so I could live as close to Pippa as possible. They kindly agreed, and before George returned to Meru, I was installed at their home a few miles away. Next morning I found Pippa still dopey, but not sufficiently sedated to stop her from being irritated by the plaster cast. In her efforts to get rid of this unwieldy burden, she threw herself around in a violent spasm, jumping high against the wall and crashing to the ground at such precarious angles that I was terrified of her breaking her neck. The pen was much too small for me to calm her down when she was in such a frantic state, so I was extremely glad when the vet arrived and agreed that should be moved into a bigger pen, the one which was at the moment occupied by 5 cheetah cubs. Julian very kindly helped to clean the place thoroughly and arranged that enough bales of hay should always be available to keep Pippa comfortably bedded. The vet predicted that she would have been in a plaster for at least 3 weeks and would need to be kept confined for a further 3 weeks to strengthen the leg. She had to be under constant observation during this period. She needed to be turned over every 2 hours to prevent her from getting pneumonia, and besides this, someone had to see that she was covered during the chilly nights and that her pen was kept spotlessly clean. For all these reasons, it was agreed that I should sleep next to Pippa, not only that I could nurse her by day and by night, but so that she would also have somebody familiar near her during this strange and distressing time. We organized ample supplies of meat, eggs, milk, glucose, and vitamins apart from the medications which the vet provided daily. Julian most thoughtfully brought a mattress and bedding for me. He also offered to bring my food along each morning and suggested that I should have a bath at his home during the midday lull when Pippa should be sleeping. Meanwhile, she had to be under sedation all the time to keep her quiet and make her pain bearable. She still had a temperature and an ice-cold nose and lived only on glucose, eggs, and milk. I bought 2 cotton sheets for her to lie on, which I washed as soon as one was wetted, so I chinked the hay so that no fleas or smell could foul her pen. I also bought a small folding table and chair so that I could type letters outside her pen when she was asleep. During the first days, I had to hold her down whenever she began to thrash, hoping to free herself from the uncomfortable splint. After each fight between us, she licked my hands, which only a few moments before had been gripping her firmly to prevent additional injuries, and thus seems to thank me for helping her. She also purred sometimes during the treatments which the vet came twice a day to administer. As soon as she was better, she answered the chirping of the cheetah cubs who called for their mothers. I would have given anything to understand their chatterings. It was obvious that they delivered comfort each other in spite of their not being able to see Pippa. Once she helped herself up to the window sill and looking through the glass discovered two bears who were kept in a paddock opposite the hospital. These were the only non-African animals here, and they greatly intrigued her. Therefore, I had to support her every morning in an upright position so that she could watch them. Otherwise, she would have struggled on her own to reach the window sill and would have harmed herself. After 4 days, she no longer had a temperature. She ate well and not only purred whenever I fed her, but often uttered a soft "nyam, nyam, nyam," a sound which I had previously heard only from Whitey when expressing happiness while feeding. She had given it when she had been confined with a broken leg. Pippa's condition improved so much that the vet thought it safe to go away for the weekend, but he gave me the address of another vet to contact in an emergency. Next morning, Pippa was in a most irritable mood. Licking the upper edge of the splint, she insisted on keeping the broken leg on the top whenever I tried to turn her over. I took her temperature. It was 104. Alarmed, I called the second vet, who gave an antibiotic at 10 a.m. and asked me to call him again should her temperature go on rising, but he added that he would be available only until lunchtime. At 3 p.m. Pippa's temperature climbed up to 105. By a lucky coincidence, a veterinary chemist whom I knew arrived just then to visit the sick animals at the hospital. He sniffed at Pippa's leg, it stunk, and then he pressed the plaster cast until pus oozed out from underneath. Very kindly, he telephoned every vet within reach, but it was a Sunday and it was 5 p.m. Before he found a vet at home, his arrival coincided with the return of Pippa's first vet, who had come back from his weekend trip sooner than he had anticipated. After anesthetizing her, the two vets removed the plaster cast. The leg from the elbow to the tooth was gangrenous, and there was also a large hole filled with pus where the edge of the splint had chipped the shoulder during Pippa's attempts to tear it off. The hair, which still covered a few places on her leg, came off like cotton wool as soon as it was touched. Both vets regarded her case as hopeless, for the circulation of blood had stopped. The leg was dead, and within 3 days at the latest all the flesh would wither and the bones rot away. Both suggested destroying her instantly. Panic-stricken, I insisted on having the opinion of yet one more vet. He was not available until the next day. Meanwhile, Pippa was kept under heavy sedation and injected with antibiotics. In spite of this, she had a very bad night, during which I changed her bandages 4 times. My hope was now pinned on a fourth vet. When I turned up around midday, he made a thorough examination and told me he believed the leg could be saved, but he warned me that Pippa might never recover its full use. I had seen several wild animals, including predators, surviving in the wild on 3 legs or with only 1 eye, and even if Pippa would never be able to hunt again, she could be an individual link in helping me to rehabilitate more cheetah and perhaps enjoy another 10 years of living semi-wild. After consulting the first vet, both vets agreed to work together. The original vet would visit Pippa in the morning, while the fourth and latest vet would come in the late afternoon, both leaving notes for each other about their treatment. The fourth then started dressing the wound with erythrin ointment, and he prescribed kaolin polytics to draw out the infection and prevent further gangrene contamination. A grim routine developed. Vet 1 called at 8 a.m. to inspect the wood and sedate Pippa for the day. Although I greatly appreciated his cooperation, knowing that it was against his principles to keep an animal alive who was badly injured as poor Pippa was, his pessimistic outlook had a very demoralizing effect on me. After his visit, I would feed Pippa with raw meat, eggs, and milk, warm up the Pulitex every 10 minutes and change the dressing, give frequent injections or enemas with a solution of glucose and salt to prevent dehydration, administer medicines for her digestion, which was often upset by the sedatives, keep the syringes clean, wash the sheets repeatedly, and scrub the pen. Between these chores, I sat with Pippa, stroking and brushing her, which she liked. Sometimes she uttered a heart-rending moan, calling the cops. In her circumstances, she would stare at me with widely dilated pupils until she recognized me and relaxed.